What is the Axial Age? In what ways is Axial Age thought different from the religious and philosophical ideas that came before? Yeah, so the Axial Age is really about 500-year period. Some people put it a little bit longer, some people put it a little bit shorter. But it's a general time where you see a religious and philosophical shift in a number of locations around the world, particularly in Eurasia. And it's a shift in the way that humans sort of understand society, religion, the relationship to nature. And really, if you look around the world at sort of the major world religions and philosophies of today, most of them were either developed during this time period or have close ties to it. We talked last week a little bit about Zoroastrianism and how Zoroastrianism was sort of one of the very first Axial Age religions and how that went on to influence and impact later religions. And really, all the Axial Age ideas here are going to have very long lasting influences and impacts. And in a lot of ways, you can really think of this shift as looking at sort of another way that religion is generally changing in response to how humans are living and interacting with themselves and their environments. We talked about how sort of the very first iterations of religion seem to be very much tied to sort of ancestor worship, to be tied to sort of shamanism, to be tied to sort of a very sort of personal relationship sometimes with elements and the local natural environment. As time goes on and people develop agriculture and start living in larger and larger groups of people, that's when you start having the creation of these anthropomorphic nature gods, right? Where you're very much tied upon, depending upon those natural elements. So you are trying to, um, so that you're trying to, appease the gods so that they bring rain, or praise a god for inhabiting the Nile River. The sun god, very very important. Fertility gods and goddesses. But generally, these pantheons were very very similar to sort of the human societies that were present at the time. So developing into sort of a kingship model. You see that model developed into a lot of times as pantheons, where there's some sort of hierarchy of the gods, a king of the gods, and so forth. Um, and eventually, that starts changing as really during this time period, people have begun living in larger, more complex societies. And while there are still a lot of those elements that were present, yes, nature and the elements are going to be still very important. If you're living in a larger imperial system, it's not quite as sort of looking for. You're not quite as dependent as if you're just in one city, and if the river floods, pretty much everything you have is wiped out. If you're living in an empire, maybe your city might be damaged, but perhaps there's going to be relief coming for you. There's going to be other villages or people who you can go and evacuate to, and so forth. So certainly those natural elements are still going to be very important, but they're not quite as prescient as they may have been to those very earliest agricultural societies. Um, Same way with the political structure. While certainly there were still lots of hierarchy in the political structure, there's still going to be, a king or some sort of monarchical system in most of these societies, a king or an emperor or so forth. A lot of times they're going to be much more farther removed from the majority of the people. Once more, if you're living in a larger imperial system, it's going to be different than having like the king of your town, who you probably see on a fairly regular basis. You see their processions through the town. You know that if you do something wrong, the king and his men can show up at your door. A little bit different in that context than if you are living out in the hinterlands somewhere, and there's a mayor of your town, there's a regional governor, and somewhere there's sort of this abstract idea of there being an emperor, but someone who chances are very high you're never going to see, you're never going to meet, you're never going to interact with. um, but increasingly what you start seeing is that it's going to be the focus of these new religions and philosophies are going to be focusing on morality and ethics in an attempt to lead to a stable society. Because you're having populations increasing. You're having empires becoming more complex and more diverse. So you really see an emphasis being put on trying to create philosophies and ideas and religious principles that are going to stabilize a society to a large degree, to a degree where the sort of previous ideas of gods who sort of act like humans a lot of times maybe won't have the humans' best interest in mind or don't really care about the humans or sort of doing their own things. There wasn't in a lot of those religions a great sense of morality linked to the gods. For the most part, there were certain obligations that rulers had to do or religious people had to do, priests and priestesses and so forth to sort of appease the gods. But certainly through the Axial Age, one of the biggest changes is that it becomes much more focused on individuals, that everyone within a society sort of has a role to play in a lot of these ideas. And it's not that the only important people are people at the very top of sort of the religious or political structure. A really good example of this is what we learned about Zoroastrianism last week, right? Where essentially, there was this big conflict myth that was created between good versus evil, but the actors in that struggle were people. It was humans, people choosing the right actions, the right thoughts, the right words, the right deeds were the ones who were going to be combating these evil forces. And it was sort of everyday, ordinary people who had an impact on this. There's going to be a much more of an idea of people having sort of an independent relationship with the divine too. That was something that you were sort of supposed to have, or that everyone could have, not just a certain few select people or individuals. And because of this sort of focus on the individual's role and part, oftentimes sort of the mainstay of these ideas is going to be that sort of morality is the key to it. That it's people who are all supposed to be acting in a certain way, following certain rules, once more, doing these things that are going to help sort of stabilize society around them. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that these are all going to be the same, and you can come to some very different ideas and thoughts about what makes for a stable society, as we're going to be discussing later today. That, like the comparison between legalism and Confucianism, essentially are going to have the same goal, wanting to have stability within sort of within the country, but they take incredibly different ways on how to get there. We have sort of the incredibly strict authoritarianism of legalism versus the sort of idea of, well, if everyone just sort of follows these basic relationships and does sort of the right thing, we'll sort of get there in a way that doesn't require super strict and harsh measures, as that was what Confucianism was really arguing. So while these are sort of general principles, the way that they are going to try to be grabbed or achieved or obtained is going to vary greatly depending on what society we are talking about, and what set of ideas they are sort of focusing on. But you certainly have a much different connection to people's connection to, like I said, the divine, to nature, to this idea of enlightenment, this idea that people can sort of, through various means, come to have a better understanding of what the world is really like. You really start seeing at this point in time this idea that the world, as just everyday, ordinary people sort of understand it, isn't necessarily the real world, that you need to have some sort of special enlightenment, whether through meditation, whether through prayer, whether through some sort of contact with philosophy or religion, to really sort of understand what's happening in the world around you. You also see a lot of times these lead to much more complex ideas then, where it's not as simple as, there's some gods and when they fight it makes thunder. No, there's much more complex ideas as far as how people are supposed to be reacting or interacting with the divine. What gods are how they are creating things, why are they doing it, and just looking at something like Christianity, the eventual theology of sort of breaking this idea of God into various parts, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, a much more complex theology than simply saying, there's a God. He doesn't like his brother. They got in a fight at some point in time, and then they made the world. So the stories and the rationality and the responsibilities that people have are going to become much more detailed, much more intricate, and much more complex. Um, and really, I think it's partially in the quest for this sort of stability that you really do start seeing those ideas of patriarchy, which we saw introduced in earlier iterations. Of course, we talked about how patriarchy had increased in the development of urbanization and through the process of agriculture and the Neolithic Revolution. And really, you're going to see a codification then of a lot of those patriarchal ideas in a lot of these religions. They're going to take sort of the very strict separation of genders and gender norms and gender roles, which had become prevalent within a lot of these locations, and they're going to try to codify it and rationalize it and ultimately make it much more sort of difficult to potentially push back against, because now you're not just saying, well, yes, this is a social problem. Now it's going even further to say, well, now we're saying this is the way the gods or a god thinks it should be or how it should be. And it's going to really sort of be sometimes kind of the bedrock of sort of the social structures. Lineage is going to be traced back through through certain patriarchal practices and inheritance, who can own property, who can't. And increasingly, it's going to be more and more difficult, oftentimes, for women in these societies to try to gain those basic rights that they would have had before the sort of broad, large-scale stratification in these agricultural states. And really, you can see the Axial Age certainly setting up a lot of the philosophical and religious ideas that we have, but it's also going to, in a lot of ways, entrench some of those other aspects that we're looking at and talking about as well. So it's interesting to sort of see the go-between and the sort of long-scale impacts that the philosophy is going to have. Describe how legalism, Confucianism, and Taoism reflects aspects of Axial Age thought. Um, and yeah, each of these three I think are a good example of how in just one location you have multiple different outgrowths of Axial Age thinking about the same time, developing within just a few hundred years of each other, and how even like I mentioned, while they're all trying to accomplish some of the same goals, they're going about it in very different ways, and creating some very complex, intricate ideas and philosophies to go along with them. So let's start with Confucianism. Confucius's main goal was trying to, as mentioned in the Axial Age portion, try to figure out how to create a stable, well-run society. And Confucius really saw society as a series of relationships. He thought that sort of the bedrock of any society needs to be how people interact with each other, and that they should be interacting with each other in the correct way. So the way that a father interacts with his son, a husband interacts with his wife, a younger brother interacts with his older brother, that these should be sort of the building blocks of how people relate to one another, how people relate to the government, how the government relates to the people. And that by properly following these kind of relationships, it could lead to that sort of his ideal of his stable society. A big part of this was people just sort of behaving correctly, behaving in order, in alignment, sort of some of his main principles, Ren, Li, and Zhao, which is essentially ideas of sort of kindness, humanity, benevolence, filial piety, and that then there should be people who are the people who do sort of exhibit those kind of behaviors, Junzi, as sort of his name for them, who are these sort of superior individuals who he thought should sort of then act as role models for the rest of society. That if people saw sort of these Junzi following the tenets of Confucianism and engaging in these relationships correctly and being sort of kind and benevolent and so forth, that everyone else would want to follow along with that example, and you would then have sort of this peaceful, idealistic society around you. So these are very much reflective of Axial Age thought for a number of reasons. First of all, it is a lot of thought about the nature of people and human beings. This idea that people are sort of inherently good, but they need sort of good examples to push them towards this correct behavior. So a lot of thinking about just what is the nature of humanity? How do people typically act? Why do they act that way? And how can we get them to act in a way that is beneficial for those around them? Those are some pretty deep questions that you didn't see a lot of earlier philosophical ideas really bothering to take into account or consider. Um, it's also sort of a very complex understanding of this idea of sort of the state mirroring the family. That you're trying to not just think about human relationships, but you're trying to extrapolate from those human relationships into governmental relationships. So this is very much, fitting very well into that idea of, the main important actors in Confucianism are the people. Are people behaving and acting in the right way, following the tenets of Ren, Li, and Zhao, and that they are then sort of using that to construct a society that works for everyone. Confucianism is also a good example, though, of how sort of patriarchy is getting mixed into and solidified into this idea. The fact that one of the key relationships of Confucianism is the relationship between the husband and his wife, and the idea that the wife is always supposed to be submissive to the husband, that she's supposed to essentially assume her identity to his, his goals are supposed to be her goals, and she's sort of just supposed to be there to support him, to raise the family, and that in return, sort of the husband's obligation is to, treat his wife well, but it's not a mystery that all the power in the family is supposed to be with the husband. So you can see that, in the attempt to try to bring this sort of stability to society, essentially it's taking power away from almost half of the people in the society in order to try to achieve that to a certain degree. But certainly looking at it from an axial age perspective, you can really see that very detailed concept of, humans, how they're supposed to interact, what they're supposed to be doing, and how that can sort of build a larger, better society is sort of the hallmark of Confucianism. Taoism is another perfect example, and Taoism is certainly about Confucianism. It was sort of much more philosophical in nature, as far as very much concerned about the government and how a state should be run, how society should be constructed, and towards that you should have sort of all these people being very active and being these sort of good role models. And of course there's going to be a lot of education that's going to be set up around Confucianism eventually, and people trying to figure out how they can sort of be these perfect Confucians. Taoism takes a much more sort of spiritual approach to things and focuses much more on awareness and understanding of nature, trying to figure out what is nature, how do human beings fit into it, and what can human beings sort of learn from nature to sort of best fit into the world around them. A big key of Taoism is this idea of balance. How whenever there's sort of a reaction, an action, there's a reaction. You very much saw this in the document, right? When whenever something's good, there's something that's bad that goes with it too. So that this idea of balance, and of course, this is where you get that imagery of the yin yang coming into play, is very central to the idea of Taoism. And striving to be sort of a good Tao then is to try to sort of adopt a sort of passing and yielding nature to the world around you. You're not supposed to sort of fight back and struggle against nature or against the fates. You're supposed to sort of let it wash over you and sort of become one with the world. And a big part of this idea was the idea of sort of a separation from separations from distractions of worldly affairs. Wu Wei is kind of the terminology for it, where you wouldn't be interested in participation in government or competition or your status within society, things like that, and that sort of instead you should be sort of focusing on observing and interacting and engaging with sort of the beauty and the nature that's around you without getting too eager to go in one direction or another, or fight or strive too hard to sort of increase your prestige or to fulfill your objectives and so forth. So very much central to, once more, sort of this axial age idea that figuring out humans' place in nature. The idea of introspection, right? That a lot of Taoism is supposed to be people contemplating and thinking and building their knowledge and their wisdom, and that very much is still looking at the kind of the individual level and how they are living their lives, and from there trying to use that introspection and contemplation to sort of arise at an inner peace or an inner happiness, and that's sort of the end goal. That's kind of that becoming one with the Tao, when you're no longer sort of struggling against the fates of the world. So very interesting, and we're going to be doing some comparisons between these religions and Indian religions, Axial Age religions, next week, and you're going to see a lot of tie-ins between Taoism and some of the Indian philosophies and how they sort of picture the place that humans are supposed to play in the world, and that idea of sort of not fighting back against sort of the tide of the universe is a very large central theme. Legalism, completely different philosophy here from the other two. Legalism very much was interested in one thing and one thing alone, and that was the creation of a strong, centralized state supported by a strong army and fed by strong agriculture. The state in legalism is sort of the end goal, supporting that sort of very strong, very authoritative state. And in order to achieve a strong state, a strong army, and a strong agricultural base, legalism essentially says you need social engineering to make sure everyone is going to be doing their part to support these sort of three key tenets. As a part of that, then, it's really pushing towards sort of a collective identity where people should not be having their own ideas or their own aspirations. Everything that everyone does should always be in service to supporting the state in some way, shape, or form, and that the society should be engineered to make sure people only focus on supporting the state, not supporting sort of their own happiness or their own ideas or their own ambitions. A big part of legalism then is essentially trying to make sure that everyone is going to be doing, essentially going to be doing that. The idea of sort of very harsh punishments for even minor crimes, making sure that no one is going to be breaking the law in any form. It's kind of this idea that if you execute people for jaywalking, there's no way they'd want to rob a bank. Very. Certainly people had a lot of sort of objections to that, and have since that maybe that's not sort of the best way to try to deter people. But that's certainly sort of the idea that they're coming at it from. You also have them, of course, forcing large people into state projects, forcing them to build roads and dams and bridges and Great Wall without them having any kind of say. So essentially, sort of using the people as kind of a slave population. And all this is coming from a perspective that kind of once more looks at the nature of people. And legalism really looks at people as being inherently bad. And without sort of this very strong, very strict, very authoritarian guidelines, that society falls apart because everyone's sort of doing their own thing. They're not caring about supporting a strong state, and therefore the state is going to sort of crumble in upon itself. And while certainly the idea is sort of this collective a push towards collectivization, it's still individual in the sense that it's all based upon people sort of doing the proper role according to legalism. That people are supposed to sort of be brave and strong and supporting the state and not following their personal ambitions. So the only way legalism sort of works is if the state, of course, sort of puts in these very harsh guidelines, and then if the people themselves actually follow it. And you certainly see then some very detailed justifications for this, as you're going to be seeing in the document exercise coming up. That it's not just the fact that they're sort of imposing a very draconian, authoritarian regime, but then they're sort of arguing why this is a good thing for them to be doing or why it's a necessary thing for them to be doing. Where certainly, there would have been states before this that could have been seen as very sort of authoritarian in nature, but they didn't spend a whole lot of time rationalizing it. They didn't sit there and make a huge argument about why they're actually the good guys for doing it or why it's necessary to be doing it. They just essentially did it. And once more, with legalism, you come back to that idea of sort of that complex understanding and description of the world the way it is and why things should be a certain way. And that's certainly going to be present with sort of the legalist philosophy, that it's not just we're going to be constructing this kind of state, but we're going to be spending a lot of time rationalizing it and thinking about why this is going to be giving us the results that we want, even though, of course, it's going to eventually lead to a state that might be okay for a very few people, but it's going to be pretty terrible in most senses for everyone else living within a legalist state. To what degree did the Han Dynasty build upon the traditions of previous Chinese empires and states? What aspects of the Han Dynasty were new to China? So certainly the way that the Han Dynasty comes to power is very much reminiscent of that sort of dynastic cycle idea, right? The mandate of heaven, the fact that the Qin Dynasty had essentially lost the mandate, that they were treating the people poorly, that there was, natural disasters and all sorts of reasons why it looked like the Qin was losing control, which made it sort of proper for Han Mudi to rise up to seize power and to sort of start the dynasty. So you see sort of right at the beginning, it's building once more upon this idea that after they gain power, the majority of the country is then going to sort of very quickly becoming back into the fold and allowing the Han Dynasty to very quickly build itself into a very strong imperial state. Governing wise, you do have this sort of duality that previous Chinese empires had, where there was sort of a strong centralized state, but with a decentralized administration, meaning that the government itself was very large and very active, but because of the large size and scale of China, a lot of the authority had to be relegated to local governors and local officials. And that leads to one of sort of the new things, of course, with the Han Dynasty was the adoption of Confucianism and the creation of this very complex bureaucracy. Because China was so large and had such a large population, it almost made sort of this very large bureaucratic class a necessity to keep things running smoothly. So this sort of commitment to an education of a professional class to figure out how to sort of run and operate the country was something very, very central to the Han Dynasty and is eventually going to sort of become a hallmark of China, that they're always going to have a high degree of specialization and a high, very sort of specialized class of people whose role is going to be essentially governing and governance and figuring out how to govern well and how to govern such a large and diverse empire like the Chinese Empire is going to become. The importance on agriculture, of course, very, very important still, and that's going to be adopted from previous iterations. Writing and just sort of the importance of record keeping and eventually how that's going to become very important for the bureaucratic system. Sort of combining the old with the new. Also sort of combining sort of the traditional states. A strong army is going to be very important to the Han Dynasty, the ability to expand their borders and to make sure that there isn't going to be any sort of internal turmoil for at least quite a while the Han Dynasty is able to build and expand and prosper. Other new aspects, the commitment to trade, right? The creation of the Silk Road after they expand into Central Asia, becoming really a very large sort of global trading power for the first time, and starting to trade out some of those goods such as silk and porcelains and so forth, and bringing in a lot of money and other sort of exotic goods from Central Asia and all the way to the essentially the Persian Empire into India, and that's going to be a very sort of important aspect of China moving forward as well. All right, looking at our letters written to historical individuals. Yeah, I thought the class did a nice job on this. I'm not going to spend too much time since a lot of these were sort of creative in focus, but I like the cross section of our important figures that were chosen for this answer. A lot of people wrote to Confucius or Lao Tzu. Han Wudi was another sort of popular choice. Some people went with more of the legalist route, writing to Shang Yang or Qin Shi Huangdi. And yeah, just sort of asking a lot of times about their ideas, where they came up with them, what had influenced them to sort of go with those ideas, and also trying to let them know about a little bit about their own lives. Sometimes comparing the writer's sort of philosophies with those of the author, or comparing sort of the government systems we have today with those of ancient China. So yeah, I thought the class did a very good job of very creatively thinking about how to you would engage with one of these historical figures. So, very nice job. What are the five most important elements that you see made Han China such a productive and economically successful civilization? To begin with, a lot of you pointed out some of the sort of philosophies that we had discussed earlier. Confucianism being one of the keys to bring sort of that order and stability, that emphasis on sort of a strong centralized government, and a government that was supported by that very active, vibrant, sort of bureaucratic class that had to essentially get sort of a formal education, had to pass these civil service examinations, so that you knew people within the government had actually received some sort of training in how to run the country. And that was a huge part of it. Some people pointed out Taoism and how sort of the spiritual elements of Taoism played into making China successful, and how China was able to combine some of these philosophies like Taoism and Confucianism together to sort of fulfill both these sort of philosophical background and sort of the spiritual needs of the people at the same point in time. Some people pointed to the technology that was developed during the Han Dynasty, things like paper, the water mill, shoulder harnesses for horses, which helped greatly in agriculture, the rudder, making nautical sea travel much easier. Some people pointed to the advancements in math and science and medicine which occurred. Some people focus more on trade. The development of the Silk Road during the Han Dynasty was very, very important for this civilization and for all sort of future civilizations really in China. And very quickly, because partially of this turn post-rudder, you're going to see China engaging in a lot of nautical sea trade, particularly in the Indian Ocean, and that's going to be developing sort of parallel to the Silk Road as another sort of major international trade network in the ancient world. But yeah, across the Silk Road, trading things like silk and porcelain, paper, bamboo, and bringing in precious stones, objects, jade, things like that, money and currency, gold. Those are sort of the things that oftentimes were traded into China. Some people pointed out that China's population, just sort of the large landmass and the large population size, was very much key and fundamental to its success. Sort of the large, powerful standing army that it was able to keep through most of this time period allowed them to not only be successful but expand their reach into Central Asia and some of the other countries or locations around China. So yeah, I thought the class did a very good job of selecting a lot of those elements that made China pretty much one of the most sort of economically successful and productive empires in the world at this point. All right, so looking at our primary source documents here, I'm going to sort of go through each one at a time and pick out some of the most common quotes that I saw people using in their documents and explaining why it's sort of representative of the various belief systems that we were talking about this week. So we'll start with the Confucian document. First quote here, I wish to be humane, and behold, humaneness is at hand. And remember, that's sort of one of the key elements of Confucianism, right? That sort of people wanting to be good, and that's sort of the main thing. Like, you want to do the right thing, and that's kind of the first step, is what that quote is saying. Next quote, now the man of perfect humanness, wishing to establish himself, seeks also to establish others. Wishing to be enlarged himself, he also seeks to enlarge others. And once more, this gets into that idea of the importance of the sort of public examples in Confucianism. That the person who has sought humaneness and has found humaneness and is living that way is not just benefiting themselves. Confucianism sort of sees them as benefiting the entire society because they're also going to sort of be helping other people achieve that level. Next quote here, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. Yeah, and this is sort of that idea of benevolence that he's talking about. And a lot of people sort of said that, yeah, this is sort of their version of the golden rule that we still sort of have today in a lot of all our cultures, that, if you treat people the way you want to be treated, don't treat them the way you don't want to be treated, and that's sort of one of a clear sort of grounding principles to the virtue that Confucius is talking about. Also, he says, virtue is not left to stand alone. He who practices it will have neighbors. So once more, this idea that doing the right thing is sort of contagious. It's going to be passing on to the people around them. Going on to the document on sort of learning, by nature, men are nearly alike. By practice, they get wide apart. And I think this is really easy. You can see even this long ago, there's this idea and conception of that sort of nature versus nurture debate going on here, and how Confucian is sort of saying, is falling on this sort of end of the nurture portion of it, right? That sort of all people are generally the same, but it's through their own individual experiences and practices that they become separate and different. So yeah, I think that's very interesting that even this far back in time you see people thinking about these kind of ideas, and that's once more that idea of sort of the axial age thought that's coming into it. Before this, you don't see a lot of examples, at least in the written record, of people having these kind of thoughts or these kind of debates. What are people generally like? How do they behave? How do they get different from one another? So very cool that Confucianism is sort of taking that into account. Next, those who are born with the possession of knowledge are the highest class of men. Those who learn and so readily get possession of knowledge are the next. Those who are dull and stupid and yet compass the learning of are another class. As to those who are dull and stupid and yet do not learn, those are the lowest of the people. So certainly this idea that those who are educated and those who have knowledge are sort of, in the Confucian estimate, supposed to be sort of the most prestigious in society. But he says, even if you don't have those things and you're trying to learn, there's still something to that you're trying to possess that knowledge. And he's saying sort of the people who do not have the knowledge, who aren't very smart, and don't try to improve themselves, that they're sort of the lowest class of people. Certainly kind of an elitist type attitude and idea here, but that idea of how important knowledge is, I think is very, very interesting. And you can certainly see how such a large sort of educated class is going to be arriving from Confucianism because of the emphasis they're putting on education, and how sort of education is sort of tied into morality here. It is not easy to find a man who has learned for 3 years without coming to good. Once more, just sort of showing the general importance of education. We still have these ideas and these concepts today. A lot of people who are in college trying to get an Associate of Arts degree or any kind of degree, a lot of it's the idea that, yeah, just improving yourself, getting this knowledge for this time period, it's just going to come to a good result. Even if you don't have, a specific career path in mind yet. So we still have this idea, I'd say, in our AA degree concept of today. To have faults and not to reform them, this indeed should be pronounced having faults. So once more, the idea is not having faults isn't the bad thing, but if you have faults, if you're ignorant and you're not trying to improve them, that's where the problem is. But if you are trying to improve them in Confucianism and you are trying to be those sort of models and examples, it's going to sort of benefit the entire society around you. So yeah, I think you can definitely see how this is some very deep, intricate thought, but how it's very much tied into trying to make the society that Confucius wants to create and wants to live in and wants to manifest. All right, let's move on to the next document, which is the document on Taoism. So the Tao that can be known is not Tao. I love this quote because it really sums up Taoism, right? This idea of what is Taoism? Well, if you think you know what it is, you actually don't. And the fact that Taoism, sort of one of its main tenets, is kind of this lifelong journey of contemplation about the Tao and what the Tao is, what the Tao it is, and how to sort of achieve that level. It's a good place to start, saying, if you think you know a lot, that just means that that's how little you actually know. Next quote, the substance of the world is the only name for Tao. So once more, the idea of the natural world, right? The substance of the world around you is what you need to experience the Tao. When beauty is recognized in the world, ugliness has been learned. When good is recognized in the world, evil has been learned. And I love this quote, right? This is that entire idea of, you can't have sort of one without the other. This is very much central to that idea of balance, right? The yin and the yang, beauty and ugliness. You can't have good without evil. That the world sort of has to balance itself out. And that's sort of being aware of that and acknowledging that is certainly part of Taoism. Once more, next quote here, emphasis on nature. Nature is not kind, it treats all things impartially. So seeing that, yeah, essentially people are all equally sort of at the whims of nature, right? If a sickness comes through, it's going to affect rich people and poor people the same. If there's a flood, it's going to flood the homes of the rich along with the poor. And that nature is sort of very, very impartial. Everyone's going to die eventually, right? It's part of the sort of natural course. So not trying to moralize nature, perhaps, is a good way to put this idea. Moving on, the sage is not kind and treats all people impartially. So kind of the same idea, right? That if you want to be a good Taoist, you should also try to treat all people equally or treat all people impartially, just like nature does. Next quote here, stretch a bow to its limit, and it is soon broken. Temper a blade and its sharpness, and soon is blunted. Amass a great treasure, and soon it is stolen. Claim credit and honor, and you will soon fall. Retire once your purpose is achieved. This is the way of nature. And this is really promoting that idea of backing away from public life, of not being too ambitious, of not trying to go too far in one direction. That's only going to lead to unhappiness. And once more, keep this in mind as we start learning and talking more about the ideas in Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism next week, because you're going to definitely see some of these same elements repeating themselves in a lot of these axial age philosophies and belief systems. And this idea of not going too far in one direction or not striving too hard against fate is going to be very much tied into that. Too much color blinds the eye, too much tone deafens the ear, too much taste dulls the palate, too much play maddens the mind, too much desire tears the heart. And once more, not just the idea of balance, but the idea of moderation is coming into play here, that too much of a good thing is actually a bad thing. Once more, keep that concept in mind because you're going to be seeing it next week. You're going to be seeing it when we're talking about Greek philosophy, this idea of a middle path, of balance, of moderation. Very, very important to a lot of these philosophical ideas. Understand the past, but attend the present in this way to know the continuity of Tao, which is essence, or which is its essence. So trying to incorporate the past, but be always sort of mindful of the present that you are living in. Don't dwell too much in what has happened in the past. Don't dwell too much on your successes or your failures. Try to be living in the moment. It might be the modern interpretation or way of thinking about this. Yeah, so I think once more you can definitely see the very deep level of and sophistication of ideas that are going into the creation of these belief systems. Last but not least, let's take a look at legalism. And while the first two documents were very much into virtue and benevolence and trying to sort of be good and be at harmony and at peace and so forth, legalism is much, much different from these other two. So let's start going through these quotes and seeing where we end up. The stupid do not even understand an affair when it has been completed, but the wise see it before it has pronounced. One cannot let the people share in the thoughts about the beginnings of an affair, but they should be allowed to share in the rejoicing over the completion of it. Trying to essentially control information is what this quote is about, right? Trying to say that you shouldn't let people, sort of the general population, know what the government's doing or what the government's planning, because they're not going to understand it. But after it's done, if they want to sort of celebrate you doing a good job, you can let them in on that part of it. He was concerned about the highest virtue is not in harmony with popular ideas. He who accomplishes a great work does not take counsel with the multitude. Once more, this is very much that idea of authoritarianism, right? That the people at the top should be the rulers and that the rest of the people should have absolutely no say in what's going on, right? This is essentially very much sort of contrary to sort of what we believe in this country about representation and democracy and so forth. This is essentially saying that if you're concerned about the highest virtue, you shouldn't be concerned about those popular ideas. You shouldn't be concerned what everyone thinks is right or correct. You tell everyone what's right and correct. Moving on, you're going to see this idea sort of played out in the rest of the quotes here. Sophistry, which means frivolousness, and cleverness are an aid to lawlessness. Rites and musics are symptoms of dispassions and license. Kindness and benevolence are the foster mother of transgressions. So very much here you can see a complete opposite with Confucianism, right? That idea of sort of kindness and benevolence sort of so key to the Confucian ideas. Essentially, this is saying that's just going to allow people to do what they want and create chaos, and it's actually a bad thing for people to act with kindness or with benevolence because it means that they might be more likely to break the rules. And that very much sort of forms the key central part of the document here, the idea of what's going to make the government strong and that that's sort of the thing that everyone should be doing. So if the people are stronger than the government, the state is weak. If the government is stronger than the people, the army is strong. So very much once more this idea of reinforcing that there should be no say or input from the general population, only from the government and only from the army, because those are the two main things that matter in legalism. Governing through good people leads to lawlessness and dismemberment. Governing through wicked people leads to order and strength. Yeah, so pretty much saying that there should be very bad people running the government because they're going to instill fear in the population, and that's sort of the key thing to keeping order and promoting strength. So whatever the government needs to do, sort of no matter how barbaric or awful it seems, legalism says it's just fine because the most important thing is everyone just sort of staying in their place and promoting sort of the overall strength of the state. The fact that penalties are heavy makes rank more honorable, and the fact that rewards are light makes punishments the more awe-inspiring. So once more, saying that you shouldn't treat your population very well. Don't give them a lot of rewards, but give them a lot of really strong punishments. Trying to make it so that your population is sort of almost always living in a state of fear, because that leads to better results than having a happy population. Therefore, in the application of punishments, light offenses should be regarded as serious. If light offenses do not occur, serious ones have no chance of coming. So once more, this is the idea of very harshly punishing people for even the most minor transgressions. The book gave the example of chopping off people's limbs if they throw garbage into the street. Which, I mean, if you are concerned about littering, yeah, that's a way to stop it, but it seems like a very heavy price to pay to try to keep order. But that's the idea, that if someone's not going to litter, if there's going to be no chance that they're going to steal from someone, and there's no chance they're going to try to fight back against the government, because who knows what terrible things they do to a person if they're going to be this serious about just throwing trash or ashes out into the street. If the people are brave, they should be rewarded with what they desire. If they are timorous or timid, they should be put to death in a manner they hate. In this way, timid people, being incited by punishments, will become brave, and the brave, being encouraged by rewards, will fight to the death. So yeah, I mean, this is essentially, once more, this idea of sort of social engineering, right? You want to essentially kind of create a population that's living in fear, but that they're only going to be brave when they are fighting for the state, and you want those people to be, who are sort of brave and fighting for the state, to be completely without fear of death in their, military endeavors and so forth. So it definitely shows you that the main keys of legalism are not keeping people happy, not essentially doing the right thing even. Essentially the ends justifying the means, and it doesn't matter how cruel or barbaric you are, but as long as you have a strong state, a strong army, and a population that is living in fear and not going to cause any problems, that's sort of the end goal. And of course, certainly a big drawback of this is eventually people are just going to get fed up, and that there's a lot more of the population generally than the government or even the army. So you definitely see things like the rebellions that are created that lead eventually to the Han Dynasty and the overthrow of the Qin Dynasty. And you can certainly see that in modern day authoritarian states too. I mean, it seems to work okay for the people on top until it doesn't. And then oftentimes you end up having very violent and bloody, civil wars and so forth. And ultimately, in the long run, it doesn't turn out very well for for the people involved. But it's interesting these various takes that the Chinese are coming up here to try to figure out how to survive and live within this very large, complex civilization that they have created and developed. And there's three very different ways that they have constructed to think about that. Whether it's trying to be benevolent and kind and a good example to your neighbors, like in Confucianism, whether it's withdrawing from sort of the cares of the world and focusing more on nature and trying to understand sort of the moment around you, as in Taoism, or whether it's trying to have this very strong authoritarian state to make sure sort of everyone is forced to do what is in the best interest for the state or for the rest of society. Yeah, so it's interesting how there's sort of the same question being asked, but three very different answers coming to play here. And next week, we're going to see how the people in India are going to be asking some of these same questions and the various answers that they are going to be coming up with. All right, thank you all very much.